As the movie begins, we see a girl named Lee working at her office with her hands tied. She softly leans to turn on the light, walks around her desk, and then staples several folders with her chin. After this, she goes to the printer and holds the file with her teeth. The scene then flashes back 6 months ago, when Lee is released from a mental institution on the day of her sister's wedding. Moments later, her mother, Joan, arrives to pick her up and cheerfully greets Lee, but she simply stays there and stares blankly. Later, at the wedding, Lee watches as her sister and her husband kiss. Just then, her childhood friend Peter arrives and inquires about her well-being. Sensing her distress, he leads her to the dance floor, where the two begin to have fun. The same day, Lee reunites with her father, Bert, and they warmly hug each other. However, when she realizes he is still an alcoholic, she becomes upset and exits the dance floor. She then walks back to her old room and checks her tool collection. Lee carefully pulls out a sharp item and attempts to pierce her skin with it. However, when she hears the couple leaving, she quickly packs the boxes and stores them in a drawer. It turns out that she tends to hurt herself if she is a bit stressed or upset. That night, while Lee is boiling water, she overhears her parents arguing in the living room. Joan is complaining to Bert about his drinking problem and the fact that he was recently fired from his job. When Lee walks outside to check, she notices her father pushing Joan to the floor before leaving the house. Not being able to take this any longer, Lee takes the hot kettle to her room and burns herself. Surprisingly, this relieves her immensely. The next day, Lee attends a typewriting class where she tries to divert her mind. However, the only thing she can think of is her drunkard father. Later, she is picked up by her mother, and on the way home, Lee recalls the time she purposefully slashed herself, which ended in her confinement in the mental institution. Upon arriving home, Joan hides all the sharp objects in a cabinet so her daughter can't hurt herself again. Lee walks in, and she is upset that even her mother does not trust her. Therefore, she decides to throw her sharp objects in the garbage herself. In the trash, she finds a newspaper with an advertisement for a secretary position at a lawyer's office. This, for some reason, makes her happy, so she decides to apply for the job. The following morning, Lee arrives at the office where she is to be interviewed. When she walks in, she notices several files scattered throughout the office and a woman walking out in tears. Lee then walks farther inside the building and meets with the boss, Edward Gray. After the introductions, he summons her into the room and begins asking her strange questions, such as whether she is pregnant and with whom she lives. However, Lee innocently answers all of them and shows him her reward for best typing. After a while, Edward receives a phone call and requests her to make him a cup of coffee. Lee obliges, but in the process, she accidentally drenches herself with water. When she returns to the office, Edward stares at her for a moment and admires her beauty. He tries to talk Lee out of taking the job by telling her how tedious it is, but she says that she doesn't mind being bored. In the evening, Joan arrives to pick up her daughter, and Lee informs her that she has been hired. So, from the next day onwards, she begins working diligently in Edward's office. She does his errands, arranges his paperwork, sends documents to his partners, and holds stuff for him. Later, Edward informs her that he must have accidentally thrown away an essential paper. He then asks her to look for the paper in the garbage, to which Lee agrees. As she looks through the trash, Edward observes her from his window and smirks menacingly. Moments later, Lee finds the paper in the garbage and notices her mother, who is waiting for her, even though she still has 5 hours left. Lee then walks inside and hands the paper to Edward, but it appears that he no longer requires it. Instead, he begins ordering her to do other things. Without asking much, Lee also obediently goes back to her work. Later, while putting up a mousetrap, Edward checks her out, which she notices. They then lock eyes and stare at one another until the phone rings. As Lee picks up the phone, it turns out to be her father who has left the house. Suddenly, a blonde lady enters the office and requests to meet with Edward. Lee goes to find him, but it turns out he's locked himself inside the closet to avoid that woman. She then comes out and informs the woman that Edward is left. However, the woman then becomes enraged and begins causing havoc in the office, which enrages Lee. She asks the woman to leave and tries to talk with her father on the phone, but the line is already disconnected. Lee slams the phone down in frustration and pulls out her sharp tools once again. In a fit of wrath, she pulls up her skirt and tries to injure herself. However, when Edward sees her, she feels ashamed, so she stops herself and packs her belongings to leave. Later that night, Peter and Lee hang out in a laundromat. They start talking about being in a relationship, and coincidentally, Edward also shows up there. He discreetly observes them as Peter and Lee begin kissing each other. As a result, he becomes jealous and hastily leaves the place. The next day at work, Edward rushes to Lee in a rage and hands her a letter that includes 3 typos. Lee apologizes, but Edward scolds her before ordering her to type it up correctly. She works hard all day to correct her faults, but Edward continues to treat her harshly. At the end of the day, she returns the letter after numerous modifications, but Edward just scolds her for her minor mannerisms and says he dislikes her fashion sense. Later that night, Lee visits Peter's house to meet his parents. They instantly like her and mention that their daughter is getting married next month and that they would like Peter and Lee to marry on the same day. Hearing this, Lee feels uneasy since she believes that things are moving too quickly. The next day, Edward summons Lee to his office and teaches her how to approach clients with more confidence. Following that, the two sit on the couch and Edward asks her about her feelings for Peter and whether they've slept together. However, Lee simply laughs it off. She then expresses her doubts about her and Peter's marriage. Edward eventually admits that he is aware of her tendency to self-harm. He requests her not to hurt herself anymore because it is now in the past. He also advises her to leave work early and walk home instead of driving with her mother every day. Following their conversation, the two's understanding begins to improve. As suggested, Lee tells her mother to go home and begins walking down the road by herself, feeling content. The next day at work, Edward scolds Lee angrily for another spelling error. He then calls her to his office and asks her to bend over and read the letter. As he starts reading, Edward suddenly begins to slap her back. Surprisingly, Lee also likes this punishment and she enjoys it. Later, she walks to the restroom and checks her injured buttocks. However, she appears to be more excited by this than being in pain. The next morning, Lee throws her sharp objects into the river, letting go of her past. However, at work, she continues to receive smacking lessons whenever there are errors in her letters. Edward also tells her what to eat, and she gladly obeys all of his commands. One day, Lee notices an error in a letter she's working on. She considers removing it, but decides against it because she wants Edward to notice this. However, when she approaches Edward with the letter, he ignores her and acts normally. Lee then returns to her desk, irritated. Before leaving, she asks Edward if he needs anything, but he simply replies that she can go home now. The following morning, Lee is hanging out with her mother and some friends. There, Joan gets a call, informing her that her husband has been admitted to the hospital. They both then rush to the hospital, and Lee is heartbroken to see her father in such a state. Later, she goes to Edward's house to seek comfort, but she can't tell him what's going on. Instead, she makes an excuse concerning a letter that is due the following day. Edward also thanks her for the reminder and requests that she leave. For the next few days, Lee begins to purposefully make mistakes to capture Edward's attention, but he continues to ignore her. He throws his red pen, which he uses to identify errors, and stops their activities altogether. Lee, on the other hand, refuses to give up and tries to get him back by any means necessary. One night at home, she goes to the bathroom and tries to smack herself like Edward used to do, but fails. The next morning, Lee discovers a worm in the yard and puts it in one of Edward's letters. Later, he finds the worm and encircles it with a red marker. He then calls Lee into the office, which makes her thrilled. Just then, Peter arrives in the office looking for her, but Edward tells her to ignore him and commands her to bend over. He then asks her to remove her clothes and assures her that he is not interested in having sexual relations with her. Outside, Peter calls out to Lee, but she tells him to leave since she is too busy. She then reluctantly obeys Edward's commands while he pleasures himself while looking at her body. As he finishes, Edward returns to his chair and asks her to fetch him lunch as if nothing happened. Confused and unsatisfied, Lee then goes to the restroom and discovers a typo letter on her back. She then starts pleasuring herself while thinking about Edward. Meanwhile, Edward discovers a stain on his clothes and urgently tries to get rid of it. He then takes photographs of Lee and burns them outside. The following morning, he calls Lee and asks her the same question he asked her during the interview. He informs her that he likes her, but she can't work with him because of her behavior. Lee believes it's all a game, but Edward is serious and informs her that she's been fired. Devastated, Lee slaps him and then tries to convince him that she will correct all of her annoying behaviors. However, Edward doesn't budge from his decision, so Lee is forced to pack all her belongings. As she leaves, she recalls the woman she saw the day of the interview. Over the next few days, Lee tries to find work in various places to distract herself. However, she also stands outside Edward's office regularly and notices the new girl he hired as a secretary. She then tries to meet new people interested in BDSM to see whether their preferences match hers. However, she eventually stops and focuses on helping her dad out. One day, Peter proposes to her for a wedding, and although Lee doesn't love him, she accepts because she doesn't know what else to do. One afternoon, while trying on a wedding dress, Lee suddenly realizes that she only loves Edward and decides to give it one last shot. She then runs to his office and expresses her feelings to him. Edward tries to persuade her that they can't live like this and asks her to leave, but she refuses. He then orders her to place her hands on the desk and remain still until he returns. After saying this, Edward walks outside and Lee sits in the posture for several hours. In the evening, Edward calls Peter and asks him to pick up Lee from his office. However, when Peter arrives, Lee accuses him of trespassing and asks him to leave. She then slaps him angrily before returning to the desk and placing her hands in the same position. Meanwhile, Edward watches with dissatisfaction as the heartbroken Peter leaves. When morning arrives, Lee urinates in the same position, but still does not move an inch. After that, several people, including her friends and relatives, arrive and try to persuade her to let go, but she still doesn't budge. Soon after, the local news also covers her, and she gets famous for her hunger strike. After 3 days, Edward finally returns to the office and sees Lee sleeping on the desk. He then compels her to drink coffee and takes her away from the office. As he carries her up to his house, Lee is pleased to see him and hugs him more tightly. Edward then prepares a bath for her and cleans her up by himself. He then places her on the bed and carefully stares at her body, and Lee says that she feels beautiful for the first time. The movie concludes with Edward and Lee marrying and happily continuing their dominant-submissive relationship.